I met Larry Haines at Eastham Prison in 2003 at a prison ministry weekend. Eastham was on the cover of Newsweek in 1986 as America's toughest prison. So Larry and I sat at the same table during this weekend, and Larry showed up and he was just miserable. We start the weekend with introductions where we ask everybody to give some background information on themselves and a few details. But Larry was so shy and intimidated that all he said was his name, and he passed the microphone. So anyway, then Larry sat at our table, and we spend all day Friday, all day Saturday together. And Larry, he didn't say a word. He didn't sing a song. He never cracked a smile, which is highly unusual, even in a place like a prison. And we later found out that Larry was he was kind of labeled the most miserable man in prison. He hated everybody, never talked to anybody. So Saturday night, after the inmates had gone back to their cells, me and the two other volunteers at the table, we got together and we started talking about what's going on at the guys at our table. And we started with Larry, and we're like, holy cow, what do we have to do to get Larry out of his shell? He's just miserable. And we really didn't have any idea. So Sunday morning, the guys all come in, and we're sitting around our table, and Larry's drinking coffee and having a couple of cookies. And I hadn't had a chance to really talk to him all weekend. And so I got next to him and I said, Larry, we've just kind of noticed you haven't said anything this weekend. So what do you think about all this? And I never will forget Larry. He said, well, I never went to church my whole life. My parents didn't believe in God, and they just didn't ever believe in taking us to church. So all of this Christian stuff is all brand new to me. But last night, about 3 o'clock in the morning, after I'd read this big sack full of letters that you guys gave me, for the first time in my life, I said a prayer and I talked to God. And I asked him to come into my heart. And then I said, Larry, that's wonderful. Did you mean it? Did you know what that meant? And he said, yeah, I think I did. And I just said, Larry, listen, I'm not a preacher. I'm not trained or anything, but my understanding is you're going to live forever in heaven. The angels are rejoicing, and there's a huge party in heaven right now, and you're going to live forever in a wonderful mansion in heaven. And I never will forget, Larry, this big grin came over his face. And that grin stayed on his face for the next 12, 15 years of his life. Larry went on to become a leader of the Christian community in that prison. He had experienced God's grace, and he talked about it all the time, how his life had been transformed by God. And 18 months later, Larry gave the closing speech for 20 minutes, this incredible sermon, really, about his life and what God had done in front of like 400 people at a Sunday afternoon closing ceremony. And 18 months later, he couldn't even say his name hardly. So it was unbelievable. He started making friends. He'd been in there 23 years and hadn't made a single friend in all those 23 years. And now he was a leader in that prison, and he went out and met all these people, and he was such an incredible influence on all their lives. And he came up to me, so we went back once a month on Saturdays. And there was one Saturday that I talked to Larry, and he came up to me and he said, Jim, I just wish everyone else was as lucky as I've been to have experienced God's grace, to allow me to just get out of my shell and overcome all of that angriness and bitterness and hate that was all inside of me. I just wish everybody was as lucky as I am to experience God the way I have. So that went on for several years. And then Larry got diagnosed. He was going to die from hepatitis. And so he went down to Galveston to the hospice unit there to die. And it took about 1.5 years for the hepatitis to take over. But in between, Larry just said, listen, I talked to him, but through letters, he said, we don't have a chaplain here. And so I've decided to become the chaplain. He didn't tell anybody, he just did it. And so for the last 1.5 years of his life, he went around to all these dying inmates and he gave them incredible hope and courage and led a bunch of them to Christ. So I don't think I've ever seen a more transformed life than Larry Haines. And nothing ever changed in his circumstances. From the day he met Christ until the day he died, he knew he was going to die in prison. He never had a chance of getting out, but he was the happiest man I've ever seen. It was unbelievable. And then Larry died, and his family had forgotten him long ago. He hadn't had a visit in 20 years, not a letter, and so they didn't claim his body. Larry is buried at the prisoner's grave and the prisoner's cemetery in Huntsville, and the only other people there are a bunch of other prisoners that were rejected, and the only people at his funeral were a bunch of prison volunteers who had watched Larry and the change that God's grace made in his life. So I'll never forget Larry Haines and the grace that transformed his life.